Labas rytas.
Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I welcome everyone to this hall who have gathered with us alive. And I'm happy to welcome those who have joined us and listen us on the YouTube channel. It's rather unusual to see so many of you during the after the COVID pandemic, and I'm very happy that we have come back to the live sessions instead of the previous working mode. It's already the 9th International Scientific Practical Conference on Public Administration. Today we're going to debate, to listen to the presentations, try to answer the questions about the resilience of the public sector, about the threats of the recent years that we had to face with and that we had to overcome. The conference consists of two parts. The first part is the plenary session. We're going to hear two presentations about the problems pertaining to the public sector. The session will be followed by the debate. It's the most interesting part of the session because this debate will be conducted by researchers, practitioners. Then we're going to have a coffee break so that you could enjoy both a cup of coffee and a chat with your colleagues. The second part of the conference is made of, again, two sessions, session A and session B. The first session, session A, will be an international one, while the section B is intended for discussing the problems related to Lithuanian public sector. I encourage everyone to raise questions for those who are here participating live and or to provide questions on the Slido platform. I'd like to say that the conference is organized by the Excellence Network of Public Governance, Ministry of the Interior of the Republic of Lithuania, Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities of the Seimas, and General Jonas Žemaitis Military Academy of Lithuania. I am grateful to the Office of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, especially the Office of the Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, for their professional approach towards such conferences. But now let us move to more interesting part. I'd like to give the floor to Richardas Juška, Chair of the Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities, for a welcome address. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, participants of the conference. I am pleased to welcome you at the already 9th International Forum that is aimed at discussing the problems pertaining to the public sector. This period was exceptional for the public sector because we had to face ever new challenges and threats. The pandemic was over when the Belarusian dictator flooded Lithuania as well as other EU member states with migrants. Once we started to address the problem, in essence, another dictator decided to launch a full-scale war on the other country. So we now have to ensure not only the political and military support to Ukraine, but also the Ukrainians fleeing war in their own country. Every crisis is different, and it demands new processes and competences, but they all have one similar thing. All the problems are the ones that people have to deal with both in the public sector and in the private sector. Public sector has to take leadership. We therefore want to talk today about how we managed to deal with the problems, the mistakes we have made, and the efforts that we have taken to adapt to the situation of uncertainty. We have learned some lessons, but we also have to learn some lessons from other partners. We have to share our own lessons with others. I am therefore very happy to see so many keynote speakers who are going to speak on a diversity of topics. I hope that we are going to speak about various aspects of resilience. We will enrich our knowledge, and I wish meaningful time for this conference. I hope that you will have a very interesting debate. Thank you. Good morning once again, dear colleagues. I have not introduced myself. I am Andrius Stasiukynas. I am co-moderator of this plenary session. I also have Vidmantė Giedraitytė, associate professor, who is also going to co-moderate the session. Vidmantė? The floor is yours. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are starting our plenary session, and I now would like to give the floor to Professor Per Lægreid from the University of Bergen in Norway. Professor is the author of many monographies and articles. He conducted many research in the field of public administration as well as other fields. We are therefore very happy, dear Professor, that you have agreed to participate in our conference and to make a speech. We are looking forward to your presentation, which is titled Assessing Crisis Management of the COVID-19 Pandemic, the Nordic Way and Swedish Exceptionalism. Andrius has not mentioned yet that the interpretation will be provided. The first channel is for the Lithuanian language, whereas the second channel is for the English language. So, dear Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we see it.
Is it okay?
Everything is perfect. Yes.
Everything is fine. Okay, thank you so much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to give a keynote on this conference. It's actually the first time that I give such a presentation to an audience in Lithuania, and it's a great pleasure for me to do that. And the topic, as mentioned, for my talk is assessing crisis management of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Nordic way, and Swedish exceptionalism. So the outline for my talk is actually 3 or 4 topics. The first one is what assessment criteria can we use to examine if a crisis management has been well performed or not. So this is kind of general assessment criteria that we can use to assess different kinds of crises. And second, I will illustrate the use of those criteria on the cases of crisis management of the COVID-19 pandemic in Norway and Sweden. So that's the first topic of my talk. And then secondly, I would try to address this kind of paradox. Why did 2 so similar countries react so differently to the same type of crisis? And third, some lessons learned and policy advices. And there I will come a bit into the issues also resilience. Okay, to the first general issue of how to assess crisis management. Well, my general argument is that this is a question of governance capacity, but also of governance legitimacy. A lot of crisis management studies has been addressing mainly governance capacity issues, but I think it's also very important to also take the governance legitimacy issues into consideration. So that means that both governance capacity and governance legitimacy is necessary for a well-performing crisis management. Capacity is important, of course, but it's also crucial that the policy measures are accepted among the citizens and that they follow up on them. So that is the legitimacy part of the crisis management. So that means also that the dynamics between governance capacity and governance legitimacy is important. So we have to be preoccupied with the interlinks between capacity and legitimacy. Good capacity might increase legitimacy, and strong legitimacy might strengthen capacity. So they might reinforce each other. While on the other hand, weak capacity may undermine legitimacy, and even good capacity may suffer if the legitimacy is low. So it's the general argument that they will put forward is that we need to have two topics in mind when we are talking about well-performing crisis management: the issue of governance capacity on the one hand, and the issue of governance legitimacy on the other hand, and how these two factors interact. But then, of course, the question comes: what do we mean when we talk about governance capacity? What kind of criteria or what kind of dimension should we look at when we are addressing the issue of governance capacity? And here I think it makes sense to distinguish between first the analytical capacity. How prepared are the government? What is the quality of the experts? Are they able to understand the development of the crisis? Are they able to learn during the crisis? How good is their means and knowledge? So this is the analytical capacity. That's of course very important to address crisis. It's about forecasting the crisis and trying to understand what means and measures should be applied during the crisis. And the second governance capacity that is important is coordination capacity. Normally, when we face a major crisis, there are huge coordination challenges. So this is the ability of the government to create coordination, especially coordination between actors, between administrative levels, and between policy area. So this is about, first of all, about external coordination vertically between central, regional, and local government, and horizontally between different ministries or different agencies or between different policy areas. And it's about internal coordination within the governmental apparatus, but also external coordination with civil society organizations, for example. So the coordination capacity is also a crucial capacity issue in crisis management. And the third one is regulatory capacity. And that is a main capacity, of course, when you're talking about, for example, COVID-19. What means and measures are the government enforcing? So this is the ability to decide on crisis measures and means to reduce the negative effects of the crisis. And it's also about ability to adapt the measures during the crisis. So regulatory capacity is really a main governance capacity. And then it is about delivery capacity. It's not enough to decide on different regulatory means and measures, but they also need to be implemented. So the delivery capacity is the capacity to getting things done. ability to implement the crisis measures and to provide basic products and services to the citizens during the crisis. So it's also about maintaining critical societal functions. So these are four important dimensions that we should address when trying to look at the governance capacity. And if the government is scoring high on analytical capacity, coordination capacity, regulatory capacity, and delivery capacity, then the conditions for a well-performing crisis management is good. And if we then move to the other side, the governance legitimacy issue, how can we distinguish between different dimensions of legitimacy? And here I will point to three dimensions. The first one is input legitimacy. That is about actually basically about trust in government. And the trust in government is linked to how open and transparent the information is, how reliable and credible are the crisis communication. It's about responsiveness and participation of stakeholders and affected parties. So it is mainly about trust in government, but also about interpersonal trust among citizens themselves. So it's two trust dimensions that is important: citizens' trust in government, and citizens' trust in their fellow citizens. And then we have throughput legitimacy. That is what's happening within the government apparatus. Are the decision-making processes appropriate? Are they following appropriate crisis management processes and procedures? Are they impartial, fair, professional? Are they taking due processes into consideration and the rule of law, involvement of affected stakeholder, transparency, and so on? So this is to follow appropriate and accepted processes and procedures when you are preparing for different means and measures. And third, it is about output legitimacy. That is the outcome of the crisis. Are the means and measures actually saving life? How is it about the economy and the individual rights and civil rights or inequality? So that's the outcome or output of the crisis and the crisis management measures. So of course, if there are few infections during the COVID-19 or the death rate is low, then the output legitimacy is high, for example. So these are three dimensions of governance legitimacy. I will then move to my second topic, and that is trying to apply these criteria or assessment criteria linked to governance capacity and governance legitimacy on this COVID-19 crisis management in the Nordic countries, focusing especially on Norway and Sweden. And then we first have to ask this question: what type of crisis is the COVID-19 pandemic? Because this is not a regular flu or an easy crisis to handle. So this is what we can call a creeping, transboundary, and wicked mega crisis. Actually, this is really a big thing. We don't know how long it will last. It's crossing boundaries. It is wicked, meaning that it is not easy to understand, and it's a mega crisis that's affected many sides of the society. And what does that mean? Well, it's a crisis that is complex. It's complexity. It's crossing countries. Of course, it's an international pandemic. It's crossing administrative level, central, local, supranational, the regional level. It's crossing policy areas, not only a narrow issue of health policy, but it's also going into other policy areas. It's crossing organizations, and it's crossing the political administrative level in the government. So it's characterized by complexity. Second, it's characterized by uncertainty. We don't really know what works. There are weak means and knowledge. The experts are not quite sure about what works and what doesn't work. Causes and effects are uncertain. And then it's about ambiguity. There are conflicting values. It's about your life, about your money, and about your freedom. So you need to, there is a trade-off between life and health, economy, civil rights, individual freedom, which also complicate, of course, the crisis management. And then it's about urgency. Difficult decisions have to be taken under strong time pressure. It's a need to respond before the crisis gets to a large scale. So timing is very important. So all this means that these kind of crises test the limits of what public organizations are organized to handle. Because they are public sector organizations are bureaucratic organizations that works better when there is a homogeneous environment and stable environment. And that is not the case when you're facing a crisis like this. So this is really a stress test on the government's crisis management. So this is important to have in mind. So when we are talking about crisis management, we need to be aware of what crisis are we talking about, and different crises have different characteristics. So it's not easy to come up with one way of handling a crisis because the crises themselves are so different. So if we then move to the cases of Norway and Sweden and try to see how the governance capacity and governance legitimacy issues have been addressed in these two countries. Well, when it comes to analytical capacity, both Norway and Sweden scored low. They were rather unprepared and inadequate. There were weak analytical capacity, but in Norway there was a more pragmatic approach over time when the Swedes more stick to one principal approach. But the hospital, for example, was organized based on the principle of just-in-time and lean management and activity-based funding, meaning that to have supply and reserves was some kind of a cost that you should avoid, and the health, the hospital was normally managed by business school people that was very strong into this lean management approach, and the crisis management plan for the pandemic was mainly based on flu, looking at it as a general flu. There were nothing about lockdowns or curfew or like that in the pandemic's plans. So the government had to improvise. When it comes to coordination capacity, it was, I would say that in Norway, it was a strong power concentration at the top, but they were also combined with informal consultation between political executives and administrative executive. And there was a kind of a smart mix of centralization, but also opening up for local adaptation and decentralization. In Sweden, the coordination capacity was lower. There were low political involvement. Everything was left to the public health authority, which dominated, and there were weak intergovernmental coordination between central, regional, and local level. On the regulatory capacity, we see also big differences between Norway and Sweden. In Norway, the regulatory capacity was high. It was a suppression strategy, was upfront, based on the precautionary principle. There was a quick semi-lockdown. There was mandatory but also voluntary measures, and the adaptation was pragmatic over time. In Sweden, the regulatory capacity was very different. There were no lockdown. There was soft voluntary mitigation strategy based on personal responsibility and the proportional principle. The government was slow in reacting, and the capacity was fragmented, and there were for especially weak and slow infection test capacity. When it comes to delivery capacity, it was high in Norway, easy implementation, but some frictions between central and local government. Healthcare was generally able to adapt, but there were problems with intensive care. In Sweden, there was inadequate legislation. It was decentralized delivery, but unclear responsibility between the administrative levels. They were weak on testing and contract tracing. Healthcare was, however, able to adapt. If we go to the legitimacy side, both countries is of course characterized by high trust in government, but there were differences in the crisis communication strategy. In Norway, they were appealing to solidarity and united we stand. And there was a joint communication strategy from the political executives in the cabinet and the expert bodies. In Sweden, there were also high trust in central government, but it decreased during the pandemic, and there were lower trust in local government. And the communication was mainly dominated by the health agency, and the politicians were more sitting in the back seat and observing. When it comes to true legitimacy, well, normal procedure and processes was challenged because of the urgency, but it was not dismantled in Norway. In Sweden, they even to an even higher degree follow normal procedure and processes, but the responsibilities were unclear. When it comes to output legitimacy, there was big differences between Norway and Sweden. In Norway, the debt rate was low. It was high in Sweden. There was generous economic compensation arrangements in Norway, and that was also the case in Sweden. There was low vaccination resistance both in Norway and Sweden. The societal functions were maintained in both countries, but in Norway there was less individual freedom. In Sweden, there was higher individual freedom. So this is a way of trying to apply these kind of criteria when it comes to governance capacity and governance legitimacy on the case of crisis management of the COVID-19 in Norway and Sweden. So the question is then, was it a Norwegian or a Nordic convergence on divergence in this kind of crisis management? And the main difference, I think, we see when it comes to the regulatory capacity and the regulatory pattern. Sweden has had, as I said, a soft and voluntary approach, soft and voluntary measures. It was more fragmented, and according to the Inquiry Commission, it was too little, too late. A principal mitigation approach was applied based on the proportional principle. Evidence and precise assessment was more important than speed, and it was mainly governance by experts. In Norway, there was a swift semi-lockdown. It was more coherent and mandatory, combining a principle and a pragmatic approach. The precautionary principle was upfront, and it was more based on speed, which was more important than precision. And it was governance, not governance by experts, but governance informed by experts. So it's much more political driven process. And if you look at the other main difference is when it comes to performance, the result pattern. Sweden scored by far highest on hospitalized and deaths in Scandinavia. But compared to the European average, it's not too bad. Denmark is in the middle, while Norway, Finland, and Iceland scored low. On February 9th, 2022, when the society opened up again for the second time, Sweden had 160 deaths per 100,000, and Norway had 27. That's a major difference. It's in 1 to 6. Total deaths in Sweden was 16,000 over that, and Norway it was 1,400. So there are main differences when it comes to concerned output legitimacy. Sweden, more open society, higher death rates. Norway, more closed society and lower death rates. But over time, the differences was decreasing. The main difference was in the first year of the pandemic, or in 2020, up to November 2020. So this has also to do with different trade-offs between values, as I mentioned. In Norway, health was the main priority, economy was ranked second, and individual rights, civil rights, and social consequences were given lower priority. In Sweden, the proportional principle was more important, paying more attention to economic issues and individual freedom. In Norway, the government was criticized for not ensuring that the infection control measures were in line with the human rights and the constitution. Sorry. Sorry about that. In Sweden, vulnerable groups are prioritized, but in Norway, they lost most of the normal safe environment by school and kindergarten closure and the sport and leisure activities. Sweden focused more on these problems by imposing fewer restrictions and were much less able to protect another vulnerable group, the elderly people. Jag må ringa dig tillbaka. Why this Swedish exceptionalism? I think when we try to, and now I move to the third question. How can so similar countries react so differently to the same crisis? And I think there are three main explanatory factors that can contribute to explain the differences between Sweden and Norway. The first one has to do with structural and polity features. Political administrative relations are different. There are different governance principles. In Sweden, we have the principle of strong independent central agencies. In Norway, we have the principle of ministerial responsibility. This also means that executive authority was delegated to one powerful agency in Sweden, addressing both risk assessment and risk management. In Norway, we had two authorities, so it was more diverse advice. And it was also about the intergovernmental relations about centralization and decentralization system. In Sweden, there was much more fragmented local government. There was lack of coordination. In Norway, there were more smart mix of centralization and decentralization, with more active local politicians and also local medical experts. The second main reason, I think, has to do with political leadership, timing, and crisis communication. In Sweden, there was a weak and reactive cabinet willing to give the health authority more power, not willing to use constitutional power. It was not a political issue until late 2020. In Norway, politicians were hands-on from early March 2020, and there were more pragmatism and improvisation in Norway. Sweden, when it comes to crisis communication, the crisis communication was more subdued in Sweden. It was more general and unclear, embraced the trade-off between public health and economy, and delegated the whole thing to the public health authority. In Norway, there was a more clear and joint crisis communication giving priority to life and health. And the third main reason why Sweden is different from the other Nordic country has to do with culture, I think. Swedish was more rule following, more path dependency, business as usual, a logical appropriateness in Sweden. In Sweden, there was lower tolerance of accepting mandatory regulations. There were less interventionistic, more individualistic culture and liberal culture, which enhanced this kind of liberal and soft regulations. Norway was more paternalistic and collectivistic culture. And there was also lack of experience with major crises in Sweden, I think, lack of imagination. Sweden has not been in war for many hundred years. Sweden had not had a major terrorist attack, for example, as in Norway. So that's also made a difference. Okay, and then I move to my last topic, policy advice and lessons learned. Despite low preparedness, Norway was able to implement strong policy measures, but avoided the most intrusive measures like curfew and things like that. Crisis management is most well performing when it combines government's legitimacy with government's capacity and leadership. The best way of a government to protect its citizens is by convincing them to take the measures needed to protect themselves. Citizens' self-effort is crucial, but even high-trust countries like Norway needs a well-functioning response strategy and institutional capacity. Depoliticization and low degree of polarization and a cooperative political leadership combined with a dynamic public sector capacity is needed. So I think a main task for the government is to get the citizens themselves to see the importance to follow their regulations and to take care of themselves and their fellow citizens. So what matters then for a well-performing crisis management? Well, first of all, trust in government, trust in healthcare institutions, and trust in experts matter. Second, social cohesion, low polarization, and low politicization matter. Third, political will, government readiness and flexibility to use available capacities in a way that aligned with public health recommendations matter. And policies and programs enabling citizens to comply with the regulation matters such as universal health coverage, paid sick leave, and so on. And implementation of coping strategies which manage uncertainties, strengthen capabilities and legitimacy, and build resilience across different areas are much more important, I think, than elegant science-based solution in these kind of crisis. So, can we come up with any kind of more policy advices? Well, first, the crisis response need a crisis communication which contribute to build a national consensus about how to handle the pandemic. So effective crisis communication is crucial. Second, centralization is needed, but also collaboration across administrative level and between experts' bodies and political leadership is necessary. Third, the crisis management principles of responsibility, proximity, and similarity does not work to handle major transboundary crises. Fourth, a broad set of experts' advice going beyond the more narrow sector-based epidemiological experts might be a good idea. And then the responsibility should not be delegated to experts alone, but difficult trade-offs should be decided by political executives and not by experts alone. The need for robust governance strategies that allow for adaptive and flexible adjustments is a good idea. Experiential learning and pragmatism during the crisis helps. And there is a need to go beyond unilateral and domestic responses and to have stronger international collaboration, especially when we are facing crises like a pandemic. So how can we then strengthen the effectiveness and the legitimacy of a national response? Well, we need to be better to make sense of the crisis under deep uncertainty, to improve preparation and response capacity. Better analytical capacity and knowledge about the effectiveness of different policy tools are needed. We need better interorganizational collaboration and coordination, more fruitful relations between political leaders and experts, and better collaboration between central and local level. And third, we need better knowledge about governance capacity and legitimacy relations. We need to craft a response that is both effective and legitimate. When the crisis goes on and on, like the regulatory fatigue, and how should that be maintained? How should that be addressed? So we need to maintain solidarity to crisis communication, and we need to increase crisis communication skills, I think. And we need to have better knowledge about how long the crisis can last without losing legitimacy. For what we have seen in the COVID-19 crisis is that the legitimacy was in a way under bigger pressure the longer the crisis lasted. So we need open and transparent decision-making processes. We need centralization is important, but centralization might also create legitimacy problems. Cross-boundary coordination is necessary, but it also requires high level of trust. So this means that it's important to look into the interlinks between governance capacity and governance legitimacy. Here are some literature that can be useful based on the publication that I and colleagues have made on crisis management in general and on the COVID-19 crisis more specifically. Thank you for your attention.
Labai ačiū profesoriui už tokį išsamų.
Thank you, Professor, for giving us the very extensive approach of the countries. Are there any questions from the audience?
Profesorė, mikrofonas yra pas jūs.
Dear Professor, thanks a lot for your great insights. I'm Rasas Maliukienė and I'm from Lithuanian Military Academy. You listed reasons why those two countries were so different in the face of crisis management. And for sure, I think we could agree that the Swedish case is truly was really very different across Europe. And while speaking with the regular Swedish people, they also always points out like two reasons that also you listed too, is constitutional restrictions and also the society's freedom, we can say. In addition to that, you also mentioned that there is a different experience in crisis management between those two countries. But if we will take all the list that you just brought to us, what would you think? What is the main reason that truly made those two very similar countries very different in the crisis management? What is the main one? Thanks.
Oh, yes, yeah, yeah. Can I answer now, or?
Yes, I think, yeah.
Yeah, can you? Okay. Thank you for a very good question. Well, yes. If you want to press me to come up with the most important reason why the Sweden and Norway are different, and you pointed to constitutional differences between Norway and Sweden. I am not so sure that that's the main reason, because especially if we compare the way Sweden handled the economic part of the crisis management compared to the infection, to handle the infection and the spread of the virus, or the regulatory means and measures that they did there were very big differences. Sweden was more or less exactly similar to Norway when it comes to economic support and packages to handle the crisis, but very different when it comes to the infection control measures. So if the Swedes had been willing to do it, they could have done like in Norway. Also, there were not that big constitutional constraints, because if you compare the economic measures to the public health measures, Sweden handled them quite differently. So I think the main reason between Norway and Sweden is political will or political leadership. The political leadership thought that what the public health authority did was fine. So they just had a laid-back attitude and was sitting in the back seat looking at what the Tegnell and company did up to the end of 2020, before the politicians started to intervene. So I think that has to do with the main principle for handling the crisis. The Norway had this precautionary principle, life and health first, and Sweden had a much more propositional approach, trying to weight life and health towards economy and individual freedom. So the main principle that the politicians implemented was very different, and it also had to do, of course, with the timing, because when you are facing a crisis like this, it's very important to handle fast. That's the main lesson. The longer you wait, the more infection, the higher the infection rate is in the society, and the more difficult is it to handle. So if you are acting fast, that is much better than if you are very slow, as in Sweden. So I think it was not that much as question about constitutional differences. It was mainly a question of political leadership and how they decided on the strategy.
Ačiū už tokį išsamų atsakymą.
Thank you for your answer. Now, colleagues, let us move on. Thank you, Professor. And now I'd like to give the floor to our second keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Agota Raišienė.
Profesorė
Professor is an expert of organizational management, lecturer, and has authored many publications. The Lithuanian Science Council has evaluated and acknowledged the achievements of Professor, and she is listed as top 10 most cited experts in the world. So the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let us come back to the organizational resilience. That is the topic of my presentation, and more precisely, what it means to strengthen resilience, and do we need to strengthen the resilience of public sector institutions in times of uncertainty. First, I'll give you a bit of the context to you. What is meant by resilience? The last sentence of the definition is very interesting because resistant is the one that is able to avoid a breaking point. I'd like to draw your attention to our own situation in dealing with the COVID pandemic, whether we've been close to a breaking point, whether our health system is in a situation that we will have to adopt some new decisions to avoid the breaking point. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that crisis management is a much narrow concept than resistance, because resistance includes crisis management. What should be done in a certain situation? Resistance means how to be ready in crisis which might bring us to a breaking point. Resistance is also about the crisis when we live very well, when we flourish, when we rest on our achievements, and when suddenly some very unpredicted crisis comes and we fail to notice some imminent threats, and we forget that we have to renew and update our strategies when it comes to resistance. So, avoiding a breaking point is very important for the public sector, and I later on will explain why it is important. Public sector institutions are not mere organizations, and we should not be talking about resilient leaders and resilient organizations. We have to look at the public sector system as a whole. So what is meant by resilience of the social system? So resilience of the social system means maintaining the balance of system elements. We have to understand what social system is, what it is composed of, and we have to have all of them in mind and to ensure that the system does not reach a breaking point. First, we have to be able to compensate for the damaged subsystems by the operation of viable subsystems without depleting them in the long term. We have to maintain them viable because they will be needed in the future, in the hope that we will recover from the crisis. We now have various compensation mechanisms, so these compensation mechanisms will also have to be restored later on. There is yet another important factor that is important for the resilience of the social system is the ability to effectively manage the needs, challenges and changes of the system as a whole in crisis periods. We tend to address crisis in old-fashioned profound ways. We focus too much on the minor things, and we sometimes forget that there are urgent needs that cannot be pushed aside. For example, some of the needs might wait. We may focus less on money and focus on health more. Maybe in 10 years' time, we will be able to see the situation, what happened with our distance learning, how it affected our health. So I was very happy to hear to the presentation by the colleague from Norway, because we will be able to compare our situation with the situation of the two described countries.
Išsaugojimą funkcionavimo įprasto visuomenės kiekį sveikatą. Reiškia, mes išsaugojom daugiau gyvybių.
We saved more lives. It is an achievement in itself. I have no doubt about this. It is the supreme goal, but we will see what will happen with those children in 15 years' time. We will see what the country will be like. We will see what children will be able to achieve in some 10-15 years, having had this distance learning. Because we are now looking at children, at young people, at adults. They have all tried distance learning and distance work. Some of them were quite happy about that. And we might think that there is some negative impact on the health on the people, but we are not sure yet. We don't know. So it is important not to forget that the social system operates, or it has to operate, in balance. Resilience is not the final stage. It is the process of adaptation and growth during the periods of prosperity. Can we be only a little bit resilient, or can we be very resilient? Let us look at the graph by some researchers when it comes to the ability to maintain the balance. This slide shows the comparison of organizations that is a learning organization that takes care of its capacities, and the organizations that are only a little bit resilient. The yellow part is most probably the most interesting one, because it shows the resilient system. It does not drop to the minimum performal threshold and does not reach a breaking point. And what happens when some threat is faced? So such companies, well, we're not sure what will happen to the curve if it is continued, but it is important to note that the curve is not increasing. It has not reached the medium line, the one that is in the picture. Why has not happened? Why this has not happened? One might think that we have overcome the crisis, but the problem is that we are not improving. The fact is that some crises are simply too complex, and the second factor is that we don't have anything to replace the ill-functioning systems. Well, if we took crisis in the public sector, if someone wants to implement big changes, they might face some mobbing, because not everyone in the organization are willing to implement the changes. And some people say that after mobbing, you will not be able to come back to your previous performance. So this yellow curve shows that if we do not have some compensational mechanisms, if we do not take care of the system itself, we might seemingly come back to the previous performance indicators, to the quality that was previously, but in fact we will remain more vulnerable than before the crisis. Therefore, improving resilience in advance, preparing for the crisis in advance during the good times is of particular importance. We see the green line as well, the green curve, which reflects the organization that prepares for the crisis in advance and analyzes the experience and the capacity in advance. So it is this kind of an organization that can achieve growth. So the slide shows that such organizations leave the crisis much stronger. Well, resilience, it is related sustainability and viability. I don't know whether sustainability equals resilience and viability. If we are viable, we are resilient. If we are resilient, we are able to maintain our viability. So I guess these are two things that are closely interrelated. Viability and sustainability and resilience are very interconnected. Well, everything now is called sustainable. It is we talk about sustainability when it comes to food, to clothing, to economy. So for the public sector, sustainability should mean the ability to be viable and resilient.
gali būti visai kitokia, jeigu mes rūpinsimės sveikata. Bet greičiausiai apie 150 metų mes neturėtumėm galvoti. Tai reiškia, kad ir kaip mes rūpinamės savo atsparumu ir siekiame to kokybiško gyvybingumo.
We always try to achieve viability and sustainability. Well, if we aim for the performance indicated in the green line, we might achieve this in, let's say, 100 years. We have to strengthen our resilience to be able to ensure that we can achieve viability and resilience in less than 100 years. We have to strengthen resilience for the company to maintain its viability in the long term, because that's why the organizations are made for. We have to ensure that the organization will be viable and alive as long as it is needed for our society. It is only natural that after some years the organization will no longer be needed after it implements and fulfills the objectives that it was established for. Now, let us come back to the institutional resilience. I have noted for myself from the previous presentation what I wanted to emphasize when it comes to institutional capacities and analytical capacities. Institutional resilience, for me personally, is a very good thing. I believe that our public sector institutions are very resilient. Well, it is ironic. I mean this ironically, because the situation does not change, because it seems that the organizations are trying to maintain their status instead of changing. They are not prone to change. This slide has been taken from the article that I have drafted together with one of my colleagues. It speaks about the radical changes from emotion to behavior. We looked at the situation in all the regions, at the services provided by public organizations, And we just try to look whether such organizations implement changes to ensure the quality of their performance. It appeared that the public sector institution concerned is very resilient, but in fact, the results of the changes was imitated rather than real. Just as the colleague has mentioned, it is healthy to include all the stakeholders. We need to talk about the problem. So the organization was very inclusive. It involved many stakeholders, and they said that they proposed certain changes, but the people in the organization were not willing to accept the changes. We also suggested that people in the organization should propose at least 2 proposals, but well, I believe that each of us could propose at least 5 proposals to be implemented. So every person in the institution concerned gave 2 proposals, but they didn't look at the outcome of those results. The unit of the company had the task to put the whiteboard, and on that whiteboard they had to place all their proposals that were to be implemented in the future. So everyone who would come across the corridor would place this note with a proposal. But the fact was that everyone standing in the corridor were thinking whether to put that whiteboard, that flipboard, higher or lower on the wall, rather than debating about the changes and proposal for the changes in the organization itself. I believe that this example was rather ridiculous, but as we were reading about the experience of the organizations, we either laughed or did not laugh because the situation was not funny at all. We talked a lot about the changes in the public sector and how to ensure that the changes lead forward and bring progress rather than regress when it comes to building resilience. So, everyone sees the situation through their own perspective, so therefore it is very important to have at least similar understanding of the problem and of the situation. This is the first step that must be taken, because it is from the understanding of the essence of the problem that the response depends. We have also conducted yet another survey. As the expert has mentioned, expert capacities is one of the most important things that are needed, and I personally wondered whether we can trust the expert opinion. We conducted the research together with some researchers from Hungarian University and some other universities. So we looked at the expert evaluation. If we took the globally recognized research methods and whether these results were valuable. So, Swedish were the ones who trusted the experts, while Norwegians were the ones who listened and consulted the experts. Our first task was to choose the expert who is an expert rather than the leader. In public sector, it is very difficult to choose whom to trust, because traditionally we believe that every leader of the company or of the unit, a manager of the unit, is already an expert.
Todėl, kad jisai ten dirba ir jis dirba seniai.
The manager is expected to be an expert because he has worked for the company for a very long time, or because he has worked for some other very important institution and has brought the experience from that institution. So I believe that these two arguments are the wrong ones. These should not base our decision as to who the expert is and who is not. So experts
greito pelno įgyvendindami inovacijas, ko mes turime imtis, kokie mūsų prioritetai.
Had to decide on the priority areas if the company was aimed at gaining profit. But if we do not think about gaining profit, if we want to establish our reputation, if we want to develop innovations, what should we do? What actions should we take? Let's have a look at this slide. The green column shows the importance from 1 to 5. And these are the answers of our experts who believe that competencies are the most important things. Later on, another expert was invited, and that expert worked as a consultant to many companies which wanted to ensure growth and innovation. And the third expert was a professor who wrote theses on the respective topic. So, having looked at this, I don't think that we can trust the experts in the public sector. If we have invited an expert who consults, he will say, well, human resources are not important at all. But if you invited a person who works in human resources, he or she would say that human resources are of particular importance for the company. So expert opinion was extremely diverse. Therefore, as being responsible for a certain area, working within our field of competence, we had the ability to decide and to choose the expert. It's not whether we like the expert or we do not like the expert. The arguments should be different. And we found that for the companies it is very difficult to build their resilience. There are some general pieces of advice as to what should be taken. But you know, there is one interesting thing. What things do not matter at all according to the experts. So what, in fact, should be done in the time of crisis in order to increase resilience? Here you see the results from the research that has been carried out. We conducted the surveys of the managers of the companies, those who, the companies that provide public services. So these are the answers, what should be done in times of uncertainty to ensure the legal framework governing the activity of the organization, to assess, identify, and manage the relevant risks, and so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to 4 strands on sustainability, the answer would be as follows. First and foremost, we have to learn from experience. We have looked at many results of the research, and it means that we have to look at them. Then we have to see the vision and the direction of our actions. Also, we have to take a look within, a deeper look to see whether we have the necessary competencies, capacities, and what are the characteristics of the company. Well, sometimes we say that there are no people that cannot be replaced in public sector, but in fact, there are people who cannot be replaced. We need to hire experts continuously because we don't have the capacities ourselves. And finally, we have to look at the situation from the border perspective. We have to see what the situation is around us. We have to understand the circumstances. If we are able to have all those four things in mind, we will be able to get ready for the crisis much better. Well, this is a scientific conference. But, dear colleagues, we either have to teach public sector those methods that you work with, or we have to give our expert opinion and advice to the public sector, because without the context in place, we have some mathematical, economic recommendations that in fact do not address the subject matter and the essence of the problem in the public sector. Therefore, we have to look at quality methods rather than quantity methods in order to ensure that we have dedicated recommendations for that particular sector and that could be adapted not for Sweden, not for Norway, but for Lithuania. And so that these recommendations could be implemented by our own staff. Thank you.
Ačiū labai, Giedre, už įkvėpimą.
Thank you, Giedre, for the inspiration.
Trumpam klausimui turime.
We have some time for a very brief question. So are there any questions from the audience? Could you use the microphone, please? Eglė Vaidelytė from Kaunas University of Technology. This is not a question, but a remark. I do agree with many of the things that you have mentioned. This is a sign of a very good presentation indeed. The European Commission, the EU Administration Network, often speaks about the behavioral science impact on public administration. So are the well, you said that context is very important. Being a researcher on working with social sciences, I believe that social context is very important. Not every leader, not every manager in the public sector is an expert, because not every experience is good experience. Am I right? Is that the idea that you try to convey to us? Well, partly. When it comes to behavioral aspects, a human being is a very strange creature indeed. There are many complex aspects that should be taken into consideration. What could we expect from every human being? I'll be very brief. We have conducted a very important and very relevant survey when it comes to safe driving. We used to show commercials for our respondents. There were over 400 respondents. We showed the commercials of the of how not to overspeed. And we asked our respondents what they will do. And they said that we were touched by the commercials themselves, but they were not sure whether they will follow the advice. And we did not understand why their answers were of that kind. But later, we looked at women. Women said that they will not change their behavior, but I will tell to my family not to speed or to drive safe. While men said, well, I was affected by the commercial and I might think of changing my driving habits. So, well, I don't think that we have ready-made answers. We have to monitor the situation and to adapt our steps to that. Well, which means that public sector is interdisciplinary and we need many more answers to that. Thank you. Unfortunately, we are pressed with time. We are very happy about your presentation, and let us move to another very important part of our conference, and that is the discussion, and I invite all the panelists to take their seats. Let me introduce the panelists. Ms. Rita Tamašūnienė is member of the Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities of the Lithuanian Parliament. Ms. Sigita Šejevienė is the Vice Minister of the Interior. Mr. Vitalijus Mitrofanovas is the Mayor of Akmenė District and the Vice President of the Association of Local Authorities in Lithuania. Colonel Lieutenant Rimantas Raudeliūnas, Senior Advisor of the Military Service and Personnel Department at the Ministry of National Defense. Professor Vainius Smalkys, the Head of the Public Administration Studies at Mykolas Romeris University, and Professor Mantas Bileišis, Vice Rector for Studies and Science at General Jonas Žemaitis Military Academy of Lithuania.
Please let us give a round of applause for our panelists. You're well aware of the questions, but I will ask questions according to the procedure of our debate. You will have up to 5 minutes to answer the questions. You can also react to other panelists' answers. And we will then proceed on with the discussion with the audience and our online viewers. Unfortunately, we don't have any questions from the online audience, so we encourage you to use the slido.com by finding the link on the YouTube channel, and please use it to ask questions. Well, the expert is not according to the office held, but you are the experts in your field. So my first question is, Lithuania has faced a number of challenges in recent years. What are the main challenges for the public sector in dealing with the different threats, recent threats? You can see a general context and a more specific context depending on the area you are from. And we will also ask scientists to present their views as well. So let us begin with the member of the Seimas. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a person who has been faced with crisis. In my capacity, I also was responsible for managing the COVID-19 pandemic. We cooperated with other countries and we saw their response to this huge crisis. I have to underline that Lithuania was ranked top 4 country that had a early and strict reaction in response to the crisis. I was in the government at that time when the government took the decision, and in all our management groups, we were responsible for implementing those decisions in cooperation with other sectors, including the private sector. Now, what we lacked, certainly every crisis is a test for all the systems and our capacities to manage those crises, to respond. It is very important to assess financial resources, human resources in the times of the crisis. We saw that we are able to change the orientation because in terms of the entire public sector, not dividing it into different fields, so every field had a double load in dealing with the crisis. We managed to work together. We needed fast, specific decisions, and they had to be sensitive. We had to evaluate the needs of the society, and we had to ensure that even in the worst situation of the crisis, we have to understand where a change is needed. We need to be flexible, and we need to be able to adopt those changes. Communication and coordination among institutions are the areas that we have to focus on more, because interinstitutional cooperation, both inside a sector or with external partners on the national level, with the public sector, with the private sector and NGOs, we saw great possibilities here. In terms of international cooperations with the international organizations, with international experts and monitoring specialists, communication, to my mind, is the major value-added product in the public sector. We have to know where we are going, and we have to communicate it to our society. This is a message that the public authorities give to the society. And here we have to think about our communication ways, because actually it predetermines our further management of the crisis, whether our measures are accepted or not by people, thus helping us to manage and to address the crisis, or whether we will face disinformation, fake news, or unacceptance of our measures, which will prevent our unity. The main factor in dealing with crisis is unity, to my mind. So it's not only about resilience and flexibility, but also about unity and focus. Thank you. So that was my observation. Thank you. You also mentioned the trends and the aspects that need to be improved. Communication, you said, cooperation. cooperation between the public sector and the central authorities and public and local authorities. And also we need to have a normal cooperation with NGOs and to task them with, because they can be very effectively and creatively solved. We need not only to regulate and draft laws, but we also have to hear the position of the public sector, of the private sector. So we need a constant cooperation between the public and private sector. Thank you. Sigita, Ms. Sigita Ševienė. Thank you. I will try to say some more. We were faced with several crises at a time: illegal migration flows, refugees from Ukraine, and emergency situation, which has been a great challenge for the state. So the areas that need to be strengthened include communication. This is one of the essential aspects that shows where we are going to, and also helps to implement certain changes. We need to try to convince people. Private sector and public sector partnership is very important. Different crises shows different experience. When the NGO sector is difficult to attract, and the crisis with the Ukrainian refugees shows that the NGOs is very helpful for public sector. But let me return to a very important problem: data. It is very important for the state to have data, to manage this data, and to take correct decisions based on the data. Decisions might be expert-informed, and data-informed decisions are more important, which makes the public sector more efficient. We also faced another problem that we have to address, is the strengthening of expert competences in forecasting crisis and solution scenarios on how to deal with one or another situation. So the public sector has to be if the public sector wants to be resilient, it has to have several solution scenarios. And the final aspect that is important is human resources. Nowadays, we lack competent leaders, civil servants, and staff members. So this is the main message that should not be forgotten. We have to invest into human resources. Despite the fact that we had the emergency situation and the management of this situation, we have to finally have this investment into people. Investment into human resources pays off. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Vitalijus Mitrofanovas, from the position of public authorities, how would you evaluate the situation, and what are the aspects to be improved? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great privilege for me to be here among experts and scientists. We are practitioners, and our actions can be evaluated and systematized. we used to complain about the crisis, but actually I'm happy about the crisis. We should have more crises because they teach us how to live.
Krizė apibūdinama būtent dviem, jie neturi vieno hieroglifo kaip krizė. Jie turi iš dviejų dalių sudedantį, tai yra pirma baimės, o antra galimybės. Ir kurią dalį mes labiau atsveriam? Ar labiau pradedam bijoti, kas
Crisis is related to fear and also to solutions. So first of all, we are intimidated by the crisis, but then we learn our lessons, we improve ourselves, and we take the necessary decisions. Both economic and refugee crisis, including COVID, was something that I really liked. As a politician, I was able to show the competences and leadership. Professor made a conclusion that that crisis should be depoliticized. When we look at the public sector, we try to build on political dividends, political gains from the crisis. This is a wrong thing. This is what the Swedish professor said. General responsibility of the division of powers in the state, including the media, and we can see the power of the media and its ability to influence, even looking at the current crisis and war. We see a similar situation. We saw a similar situation that now exists in Russia several years ago in Kaunas. There were also some kind of consequences, and some political gains were sought as well. The pandemic and our municipality's experience showed that well, unfortunately, I haven't seen the evaluation of trust among public institutions. Even now, during the military crisis, on declaring a Ukrainian child that is born in Lithuania to a mother refugee from Ukraine. And everybody is at a loss now. And actually, I am told that that a child has to be brought to the immigration service in order to get registered. This is a very static implementation of the law, as though the laws are adopted by some mystic creatures. Any institutions doing their job have to be able to analyze those laws before implementing them straightforwardly. We face different crises. I myself am a lawyer. The processes of renovation, and they were underway in Akmenė when the laws were broken. Later on, the laws were amended,
dabartiniai,
And
sakykime, situacijai, kur arties, ko gero, energetinė krizė ir jinai šiokia tokia yra jau.
we are
Kaipgi mes sprendžiame
actually
šitus
forecasting
klausimus.
the energy
Tai aš vėl šoke
crisis.
buvau, kai savivaldybė dabar
I
nori
was
įsirengti visas
shocked
didesnes įstaigas aprūpintis saulės energetika. 2
when
megavatai, tai yra
the
investicijų, bet pasirodo turime susimokėti 2
was
milijonus.
a decision by the municipality to install solar plants for all the public institutions. But we were told that we have to pay a fee, a huge fee.
Beviltiškumas, vėl kažkas pasako,
And
palaukit, tai mes
I really
siekiam tos
feel
energetinės
this
nepriklausomybės, kur pasakoje gali
disappointment.
turėti irgi tam tikrų pasiekmių prie bendrų krizių, sakykime, ar ne. Kita ta pati, man vėlgi žmogaus teisų prasme,
In terms of human rights, we have a very interesting attitude towards people. For example, refugees from Iraq are considered to be illegal and they are closed behind the bars, and Ukrainians were accepted in Lithuania, but people, these are all the people on the both sides of the border, but actually the attitude towards them is different. Well, unfortunately, we don't have much time for discussion when we speak about the NGOs, but they have a different field of activity and different level of activity. And now let us return to the issue of trust. When we speak about human resources and declaration of Ukrainian refugees. Well, in our municipality we managed. We are the only municipality in Lithuania that were able to register all the refugees in our municipality without going to the center. We see the same experience in Poland. The level of trust is very low in Lithuania, and municipalities ask for this higher trust because people live in municipalities. They don't live in ministries, departments, and governments. Actually, the municipality is responsible for dealing and addressing the issues of many people. Well, the public institutions are responsible for ensuring continuity no matter what happens. So my question is, what are the aspects to be improved in the public sector? Would you compliment here? Well, speaking about leadership on Ukraine, this might be a secret or a disappointment. A city of Mariupol. We have many refugees from Mariupol. We have many more refugees than Telšiai or Mažeikiai. The mayor flee the city on the second day, and people were really angry because there was nobody responsible for organizing help assistance. What happened here? And this public sector leadership in crisis management is very important. And speaking with one voice, we should not seek political gains here in this type of situations. Thank you.
First, we have to listen to all of the panelists, and later on we will listen to the audience. And now I give the floor to Rimantas Raudeliūnas, advisor at the Military Service and Personnel Department of the Ministry of National Defense. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to note that many good ideas have already been expressed by Mr. Vitalijus Mitrofanovas, who talked about the legal framework governing the activities of the public sector. Because we are restricted by our legal acts of what is allowed and what is not allowed for the public sector institutions. So we need a legal framework that allows us to manage the crisis effectively. We have also talked about the experience during the crisis. It is not enough, however, to hear about the experience. We need to analyze the experience because we become stronger only from the analysis, from the good analysis of the events, from the lessons. I'd like to remind you that in 2021, the national risk analysis was conducted, listing at least 29 risks. What does that mean? That means that in our environment we face with quite a few challenges that are very diverse. Therefore, we have to coordinate our efforts. Crisis management involves many institutions, both public and private ones. We also try to engage our partners, and I believe that one of the major challenges for us is to coordinate the overall efforts and to analyze both the previous experience and to respond to minor crises, because sometimes minor crises may turn into some large-scale crises. Thank you. Well, you say that we need more data, more analysis, and to shape some strategic approach. Is that correct? Yes. Thank you. Professor Dainius Malskys, the floor is yours. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My colleagues have already said a lot of things that any of us could have said when it comes to analytical capacity, strategic approach that are important for resilience of the public sector. When it comes to management of the human resources, it is very important when it is as important as flexibility of the organizations themselves. When it comes to intersectoral integration between the public sector and the private sector, their partnerships in overcoming the challenges and crises are also closely related with resilience. But it is of equal importance to mention social challenges, the changes in social and welfare models, challenges to the healthcare system, the health crisis that we faced a few years ago, have been facing for a few years, along with national security challenges, are the ones that organizations should take account of regularly. So, internal, external security are very important factors. Thank you, Professor. Social security aspect is very important because we have to ensure that there is no crisis in the social area. Thank you. Now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Mantas Milešis. Well, it is rather difficult to say something important being the last panelist. I would like to bring you back to the slide showed by Dr. Reišienė when it comes to resilience and to resilient companies. From the history of Lithuania, what is a catastrophe? Catastrophe for Lithuania was the year 1940 when the state collapsed and when they faced all those consequences. What is could be called a tragedy in Lithuania? The occupation of the Soviet Union was a tragedy. We also faced some stagnation during the Soviet times. It is a very specific phenomenon because the system itself was degrading slowly year on year. During our conference, we come across with a very fashionable word. This year's conference is the resilience. Previously, it was some other word. So we have lived in the ideology that there is too much bureaucracy in Lithuania. We talk about peace dividends because after the Second World War, we used to say that we have to improve our performance and to make our performance more efficient. Most probably you remember the thoughts some years ago when it was said that radical Islamists will be a very important challenge for us. We do remember the financial crisis of the year 2008. But, well, this only shows that we face with ever new crises. But I am optimistic, and I'd like to say that we have had quite a few crises, and they will be in the future. And I believe that the density of crisis and the competences needed for overcoming the crisis are increasing, and we see that from the results. So it seems that this peace dividend is no longer valid in Lithuania. So those frequent crises that we have faced recently, the migration crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, well, I'm not an expert. I'm not here to assess the adaptation, but I believe that we have to become more adaptable to the crisis. What we lack is the social trust into public administrations. Moreover, in Lithuania, we don't have this interim change that would allow to compare the municipalities. We have two big regions, that is the region of the capital of Lithuania and the rest of Lithuania. Well, we have to be able to compare our situation with, let's say, that of Latvians and Estonians. I once participated in a conference on resilience that was organized by the by the Center of East European Studies in Lithuania. The lesson that I have learned there was that compliance and standardization are very important concepts. We talk about the protection of data, of personal data. We think about many things, and we allocate resources for the particular person, the purpose. I believe that we should establish a certain standard, and only after we establish some standard, we will be able to come up with some data and to compare the situation. Because if we don't have the standard, we won't have the experts who will be able to teach other organizations. Thank you, Professor, for the context that you brought us in. And, dear colleagues, would anyone like to respond to that? I'd like to respond with regard to the municipalities. I believe that the situation has shown that everyone must trust municipalities, because municipalities have the division of power and they have very clear functions. So, well, we do recognize that there are some discrepancies and some minor problems, but we should be guided by the fact that municipality is the closest institution to our people, and the responsibility sharing is a very good idea when it comes to crisis management. Thank you. Anyone else? When it comes to local governments, the mayor has said many right things. When it comes to trust in local governments, well, people are aware of the functions that are attributed to municipalities and to central government, but we should also leave some freedom for municipalities to adopt their own decisions, just like it was in the COVID pandemic. During the COVID pandemic, it appeared that some municipalities can think of the models that could later on be used and applied in other municipalities. And, well, in our media, we have heard of very many cases when mayors of one or another municipality failed to follow the standard established by the central government, but later on they proved that their incompliance was a better choice. Public sector in general, even in the face of failure, should not be the one that thinks that the situation hopeless. A municipality should be the ones that make every effort to solve the situation. We have to help the municipalities implement various guidelines in practice. And I do agree with Mr. Vitalijus Mitrofanovas that crises present new opportunities for change. We've heard of very good examples. We try to provide services for the elderly people, and those good examples came from municipalities rather than from the central government. So we do have to learn from the crisis. We have succeeded in providing support to the Ukrainians fleeing the war because we have engaged a non-public sector for the support, which was not previously used. So we have managed to employ the experience of both the COVID pandemic and previous crises and succeeded in providing support. I'll respond very briefly. Forecasting of potential scenarios was one of the things that helped us when we started working with the Ukrainians, because both the private sector and the public sector were ready for the crisis. As we already started talking about the good experience, I would kindly ask you to share this best experience, because we talk a lot about the problem. So my question now, my pledge is to share the best experience of the public sector during the crisis. And could you give some resilience recommendations for the future? Shall we start with the same order? In the context of the COVID pandemic, it was a rather long-lasting crisis, and a different planning of decisions was very beneficial, because we had to change the civil safety model, which previously was too cumbersome. in order to be more efficient, we had to adopt another way of working. We had to establish a group at the government of the Republic of Lithuania. When it comes to the new crisis management model that is under development now, that was proposed back in 2019, when another minister was in charge. I believe that a new minister will take into consideration the experience that we had during those crises. The crisis has also shown that we are able to come up with some innovative decisions, which means that we have to step up innovations. The Vice Minister has mentioned that we have accumulated various data. We have achieved technological advance. We now have secondary schools that can provide distance learning to children if they, for example, are ill and cannot participate in the education process in person. We have also noticed that we are able to adopt collective decisions, that we have to base our decisions on both the experience and the expert opinion. Thank you. I have some more global remarks, and then I'll move to some examples. When it comes to best practices, one of the good examples is related to our public service and public servants. We used to lack human resources because we had to establish certain working groups and institutions overnight during the crisis. And the process of selecting public servants was too long. That's why I was very happy that there were people who took leadership. And there was one example when we managed to consolidate 500 public servants to work in the migration department. We have managed to use the public human resources for the particular purpose and during the particular time. We understand that the workload in some institutions is very differentiated, which means that some institutions might be loaded with work more than others. Therefore, the employment of public servants from other institutions in the migration department was a very good example of best practice. Also, the reforms conducted by several ministries could be joined. We did this during the migration crisis because we had the reform of our prisons. We had some premises. That's why two ministries decided to make use of the empty premises that were left by the former inmates and to use the premises to accommodate the migrants. When it comes to the COVID pandemic, we have managed to ensure distance work. The good example of that is the work of the Lithuanian parliament, because every member of the parliament was able to work distantly. The same applies to various public institutions. Now that the crisis is over, that the pandemic is over, people are asking me whether they have to return to their workplaces. But I believe that this is the question of the institution itself. If the person can do the work at home, he or she does not have to return to work. Thank you. Mr. Vitalijus Mitrofanovas. Let me stress one more thing. Cooperation, ability to cooperate, and teamwork, problem solving are yet very important experiences that our municipality had faced. We participated in some pilot projects together with other municipalities when it comes to the reallocation of financial support. We now have weekly meetings with either the Prime Minister or, let's say, members of the cabinet. We raise the relevant questions during those meetings. But I am very happy that we are finally heard. I used to say that when there is one ministry faces with some problem, the answer to the problem needs the efforts by 2 or 3 or even more ministries. And when several ministries are involved, they used to push away the solution from themselves, the responsibility away from themselves. I remember the crisis of 2009, 2008, 2009. I was the mayor at that time, a new mayor at that time, and I remember that the budget dropped by 30%, and I know that we made quite a few mistakes because we were not aware of how to deal with such a huge drop in the financing. Now, the same with the COVID pandemic. There were quite a few problems related to public procurement of various medical devices. We now face a huge inflation in Lithuania, because it seems that in Lithuania there is a lot of money, and this money is not used for building roads and for some new projects, which means that we do need some real, genuine experts. These experts should be of a very narrow field rather than the broad one. When it comes to state administration, I'd like to stress that our municipalities are very different and diverse. Well, for example, our municipalities find it difficult to attract lawyers to work for the municipality from best universities. Those specialists do not choose to work in the regions because they are willing to stay in big cities. So when we don't have those specialists in the regions, this does not contribute to addressing the problems more efficiently.
Rimantas Raudeliūnas. We have many best practices and best practice examples concerning cooperation and involvement of more stakeholders. Cybersecurity is one of the risks, and we also have to think about resilience to cyber threats. I can give you an example when a public organization took leadership in upskilling of staff in cybersecurity, and the Ministry of National Defense trained over 200 members of staff of a public organization on the response to cyber threats and cybersecurity situations by giving knowledge about cybersecurity. And this was done in cooperation with a private organization. This shows that the potential can be used on the public sector and the private sector in order to obtain positive results. These were physical courses, and the project was finalized. In terms of COVID management, we also had the inclusion of certain experts in decision making. This is also a good example when decisions were more informed. I also agree with Sigita Ševienė on the flexible working conditions. We've noticed changes, and in public authorities, we were forced to organize remote work. And now we see that the same tasks can be achieved, and sometimes this achievement is even more successful remotely or in different ways. Certainly, we have to bear in mind cybersecurity and possible attacks, but we should not be afraid of that. We have to be prepared. We have to prepare decisions. We have to think of building our resilience and reducing our vulnerability, and have in mind that actually we're meeting the expectations of our staff members. And in terms of my recommendations, I think that it is very important to increase the attractiveness of public service, because experts who work in public sector need to be maintained there, and new experts need to be attracted and recruited possibly from the private sector. We are undergoing the reform, but we need the support of the society in order to improve the conditions for the public service, to ensure the attractiveness of public service, in order to have leaders for the leadership, for the commitment to address the crisis. The responsibility falls on public institutions. Now, Professor Vainis Malskys. Well, you spoke about best experience, best practice of Akmenė in integrating Ukrainian refugees, and the Vice Minister spoke about the future scenarios. I would like to focus on one thing. We are absorbing war refugees from Ukraine, and we hope for Ukraine's victory in this war. But what happens if it takes time for Ukraine and the number of refugees grows, and we will not be able to absorb all of them, because other neighboring countries also take these commitments, and this results in tensions between local communities and Ukrainian refugees. And therefore, we need to model our best experience and best practice. I don't like the word ecosystems, but in the Slovak Republic, that is relatively small. So this country creates different ecosystems. One, in a close environment, camps are created for Ukrainians where they can get different services, including health and language training, thus reducing the tensions in relation to local communities, because we see these cultural differences. People are a little bit culturally different, and we need certain corrections in the acceptance of war refugees. We can see the experience of Poland, which is building temporary camps for people who stay in Poland on a temporary basis. So we should also have a similar scenario when speaking about the resilience of the public sector. So this was my remark. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mantas Bileišis. I will try to answer the question, and I will mention 3 areas and give the examples to illustrate the improvement: professionality, data, and public information. Speak about professionalism. When you speak about the involvement of NGOs, different crises showed that the involvement of civic society and NGOs meant that we really can involve those who are willing. But when we speak about the staff members of the public sector, the regulations that we have are very inflexible. Civil servants are attributed to a certain institution, and very often they have different competencies that can be needed in different institutions. And this recruiting scheme is ineffective. We could create a market of competences. We live in the Middle Ages concerning our CVs, which are still put in the Word application. We could put our CVs in different forms or different applications that would be attractive. And a civil servant would put his or her data on this database and could be recruited by different public institutions. And this would mean using intensive use of different competencies that public servants have. Concerning the data, when the crisis begins, media draws tragic scenarios, but we have to bear in mind that the situation gets more stable in several months and we get data. And I thank public institutions. We have the data and their presentation was quite well. But the problem is that the media draws a very pessimistic environment. That everything needs to be done immediately, otherwise this is seen as problematic by the media. The situation certainly can be improved. We need resources for that, but to a large extent we should focus on public communication. The revolution of the internet was a real revolution, and it was a breakthrough technology. I still think that we are not adapted to this breakthrough. We don't know the historical consequences of that. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that we are experiencing the crisis of political legitimacy, and this is a fundamental crisis. and the coming of such figures as Trump to the policy without the social media effect. But the internet revolution is ongoing. It is becoming the fourth industrial revolution. So let us think about the crisis when electrical cars will be repaired by robots rather than mechanics. So thousands of mechanics trained in universities will not be recruited in the future. So this will be a crisis. So we have to think about that. I think that this is a serious issue and the public needs to be informed about that. We should not inform about the fact of the war in Ukraine, but we should inform a 16-year-old boy about his future careers and management of his future career and foster his critical thinking. Speaking about best practice, in terms of information and communication, the events in Ukraine showed that such countries as Germany were able to admit that there are two concepts of information and propaganda, and if the media has the rules, the propaganda has to be forbidden. And very often we have those soft measures in terms of fears of not upholding the values. So this more earnest view on a different spectrum of threats increases our resilience and we become freer. Thank you. Thank you, professors, for a different view and different insights and interesting insights on the situation. I hope that our practitioners will also bear this in mind. The crisis that you might be forecasting might come in the future. Any brief remarks? Actually, we have run out of time, and then if we have no remarks, we will move to the questions from the audience. Well, we need our targets or objectives. These are also very important for resilience. What is the long-term task objective of Lithuania? And I cannot answer this question. One clear, concrete answer. Well, in Japan, I can say what the main goal or objective is. For example, in Japan is to achieve the lifespan of 96. This is a clear strategic goal that all the measures, health, education, jobs, today, we have to define our goals. Are we accepting the Ukrainian refugees on a temporary basis, temporarily? Or maybe we could correct our demographic situation. These people that come from Ukraine are professionals, educated people. My social security department says that, well, we will face social problems, but in reality, I say that Lithuanians have many more social problems, and people that really had the potential were able to flee, were able to save themselves, to save their children, and to come to Lithuania. And I don't understand why we give only 1 year permit for them to live in Lithuania. I think it should be given for 3 years. And we fail to forecast this. And this good forecasting could help us to overcome crisis in the future. Rita Tamašūnienė. Well, in terms of remote work in the public sector and informational breakthrough, we should not should try to overcome the limits. We want to become the machines in responding to people's needs, and very often people lack live consultations by civil servants in the public service. After the COVID crisis, people are really anxious to meet their doctors physically, not getting health services, instead of getting health services remotely. So we don't need to overdo this. We have to speak about trust on the long-term objectives in relation to Ukrainians. I think we have to have a general idea on how to integrate these people. This is a long-term process. The war will not end tomorrow, and this will be a long process, and we need to think about integration of those people, about schools for children. Thank you. Now, I can see hands raised from the audience. Hello, I'm Monika Šimkūnaitė from the Ministry of National Defense. My question is to Sigita Ševienė. You mentioned that investment into human resources pays off and it is needed. But you also said that it is very costly. What are your possible solutions on that? Well, I will clarify the idea. I can see that the public sector does not invest into human competencies. So we do not have good experts with good competencies. So we look for leaders and managers. We are not able to offer good conditions or good pay for these people. And this is costly for the budget of the state. But in the reality, our priority is to find those people. And when we think about the reform, we have to think about additional resources from the state budget. Reda. Hello, I'm advisor to a member of the Seimas. I am a volunteer working with a Strong Together team. Well, the contracts are going to an end, especially near the seaside, and you spoke about the model camps, and this should be developed. I don't know whether the state would be able to overcome the crisis without the help of the NGO sector. What are further perspectives on the national level? We also have the problem of disabled people and old age people that flee from Ukraine, and these people are unattractive. And we want, as NGOs, to be heard. Do you really hear what the NGOs say and the pressing problems that they note? We need this interinstitutional, interministerial consultations and advice as well as strategies, because it is very difficult for us to find accommodation for people. I can understand this was a remark, or was this a question? Would you like to react to that? I will react to that. Well, the problem that you mentioned, this is a good example of interinstitutional cooperation, and the Ministry of the Interior sometimes takes its leadership in addressing one problem. Well, the problem of housing and accommodation is known to us. The Ministry of Social Security and Labor is responsible for that. We also think about that. Before the processes began, we have collected the list of accommodations from the municipalities, and we made an inventory of the state assets and real estate. And these people will not be left on their own. Finally, when you trust municipalities, social benefits, accommodations are addressed by municipalities. And people that get some accommodation through Stiprus Kartu Strong Together organization, they still come to municipalities asking for assistance and help. We need to learn from each other. In 2016, Germany had the Syrian crisis, Syrian refugee crisis, and they were given quotas and they were given baskets, state baskets that covered accommodation costs and minimal subsistence. So I'm given the answer that we need to solve two problems, the problem of accommodation and language. And this would help for further integration of refugees. In the current stage, we want to see whether these people who come here want to remain in Lithuania. And these people need to be taught the Lithuanian language. They need to be trained to get a profession. And we also have to think about the local community. And in small municipalities, it is easier. Well, the minister recommended refraining from public work for refugees. And actually, we have to think about the principle. And refugees, while integrating into the society, they understand their responsibility, they understand their duties, and this makes our communication with them easier. And they become part of the community. We have run out of time, but I can see one hand. Justinas. Good afternoon. I'm Justinas Taliūnas from Mykolas Romeris University. I have made a conclusion that the scenarios and alternatives or future forecasts should be made, and preliminary guidance for plan A or B. So this could help to create institutional resilience. But forecasting is very often seen as something not serious. So my question is about another way. Maybe we should create some internal management processes that the organization could adapt to the elements.
Вадим, дай Арише, ты не очень сейчас делаешь хорошо.
Man atrodo, kažkur mikrofonas įjungtas.
I'm sorry, somebody has turned on the microphone. I mean the participants or the guests of the conference. I will try to answer your question. Well, preliminary forecasts for crisis management should exist. The law on civil protection details different scenarios and the plans that public institutions should have, and on possible cooperation of public institutions in dealing with one or another situation. So some kind of forecasting should exist. Management capacities are not enough, but in the public sector, managerial capacities and resilience, mobility and flexibility is lacking. And this is because our competence and upskilling system in the public sector should be improved. And we know that the ministry is working in this area too, because now different courses can be trained, but all this, it depends on the cost of those courses. But the plans should exist and the forecast should exist. Otherwise, we would have a complete chaos. Unfortunately, colleagues, we don't have time. Well, I want to say that the plans should be realistic so that people understand what should be done and why it should be done. So clarity is the necessity. We have many plans in our state, but oftentimes they don't work. So they have to be brief, they have to be clear, so that every person should know what and who is responsible for what. So I go for clarity and for briefness. Dear colleagues, dear panelists, thank you very much for your insights and for your ideas. I know that you are still willing to speak. Now I invite you to continue this discussion with a cup of coffee. And let us join Section A and Section B. Section A is here, and Section B is Kazimieras Antanavičius Hall. And we have a very short break because the sections start at 12:30. So you have to be you need to be very quick.